It was just past midnight in the Solomon Islands. Japanese destroyers cut through a narrow stretch of ocean called the Slot. Radios loud, engines roaring, convinced the night belonged to them. They weren't expecting resistance, not from 6 small American boats made of plywood. Mosquitoes, they called them. Toys. Each crew barely older than 20. Each vessel too thin to stop enemy fire and armed with torpedoes known to fail. But in that dark silence, those wooden boats drifted into position like ghosts. What happened next would rewrite what naval power meant in the Pacific, proving that sometimes the smallest force, used in the most daring way, can cripple an empire. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe to No Man's Land, where forgotten battles, unlikely heroes, and the darkest turning points of war are brought back to life. The wooden hull of PT-109 creaked as it moved through the black waters, engines throttled back to stay silent. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, only 26 years old, stood at the helm of the patrol torpedo boat, eyes fixed on the dark coastline of the Solomon Islands. His crew of 12 were trained to use speed and surprise, not strength. These boats were built for hit-and-run tactics, fast enough to strike larger ships and vanish before the enemy could react. But faulty torpedoes, limited visibility, and heavy Japanese patrols made every mission feel like a gamble, with almost no odds of survival. PT boats were made of wood, coated in gasoline-based paint, which meant one tracer round could turn them into a floating fireball. Kennedy knew it, and every man on board did too. Japanese naval planners believed that slimmer, fast-moving destroyers would dominate night battles across the Pacific. Their doctrine relied on well-trained crews, aggressive maneuvers, and torpedoes with deadly accuracy. American PT boats, by comparison, were seen as reckless inventions. Too small, too exposed, too unreliable. Even American command had low expectations for them. They were assigned tasks no one else wanted: intercept missions, shoreline harassment, and night raids where detection meant almost instant destruction. Yet Kennedy understood the one advantage he had: unpredictability. Japanese captains expected big ships, radar, and powerful guns. They did not expect a plywood vessel sliding across black water, engines barely whispering. As the Japanese Tokyo Express convoy approached that night, gun barrels scanned the horizon for cruisers, not fast patrol boats. What they did not know was that PT-109, with no armor and almost no chance of escape if discovered, was about to break every assumption the Imperial Navy had made about warfare in the dark. Japanese forces had grown confident during their nighttime supply runs through the Slot. Their destroyers, loaded with troops and cargo, would race toward Guadalcanal to reinforce ground operations. They relied on speed to avoid American detection, believing nothing small enough could challenge them up close. The Imperial Navy called these runs the Tokyo Express, and for months they operated almost untouched. Their commanders believed the Americans were too cautious to engage in direct combat at night, especially with smaller craft. What they did not expect was that desperation would drive new tactics. PT boats like Kennedy's were never meant to go head-to-head with destroyers. They had no radar systems, limited visibility, and relied on the human eye. Each torpedo launch depended on estimating distance using instinct and experience. Worse, U.S. naval torpedoes carried the Mark 14 detonator system that was notoriously unreliable. Many officers claimed it failed more than 80% of the time under combat conditions. Still, the PT crews were ordered to intercept an incoming Japanese convoy on the night of August 1st, 1943. Their objective: disrupt, delay, and force mistakes. Kennedy briefed his crew using calm but direct words. He understood the risks better than anyone. A destroyer could fire one accurate salvo and split their vessel in half. Each man wore life vests, not as safety gear, but as preparation for when, not if, they ended up in the water. As they moved into intercept formation among other PT boats, their engines idled. The men watched the horizon, the moon casting faint light on the waves. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and carrying weapons that often failed. But unpredictability remained their only strength. They would attack close, so close that Japanese ships would have to choose between turning to fire or risking collision. At that range, one mistake could change everything. And on this night, a mistake would come. Not from Kennedy's crew, but from one of the largest destroyers in the Tokyo Express. The night sky was heavy with mist as PT-109 drifted toward its patrol zone. Kennedy stood outside the cockpit, scanning the darkness. It was now after 2 a.m., and visibility had dropped to almost zero. The engine ran at minimal speed to avoid detection, creating only a faint ripple on the water. The crew knew that radar was useless against them because they were too small to register on enemy systems, but this advantage went both ways. They also could not detect enemy ships until they were dangerously close. Kennedy relied on instinct, listening for the low rumble of heavy engines. Moments earlier, 3 other PT boats had fired torpedoes at the convoy, but hit nothing. Japanese destroyers had changed course, cutting through the area with more aggression than expected. Kennedy's boat moved slowly, trying to reposition, when suddenly the lookout spotted a dark shape emerging from the haze. It was not a cruiser or small escort vessel. It was the destroyer Amagiri, a 2,000-ton ship traveling at nearly 35 knots. At that speed, it could cover a football field in 2 seconds. Kennedy had less than 5 seconds to react. He shouted for evasive maneuver, but before the helm could respond, Amagiri's massive bow sliced into PT-109 at full speed. The impact was explosive. The wooden hull shattered. Fuel ignited. Flames shot into the air as Kennedy and his men were thrown into the black water. The destroyer never slowed down. It continued into the night as though it had struck driftwood, not an American vessel. 11 men fought to stay afloat in the burning sea. Kennedy, despite an injured back, swam through oil-thick water, calling out for survivors. 2 men were unaccounted for. One was believed trapped in the wreckage. The other was unconscious. The group knew they were now behind enemy lines, drifting toward Japanese-held islands at the mercy of currents. Their boat was gone. Their weapons were gone. But Kennedy was still alive, and what he would do next would determine whether his crew saw another sunrise. Kennedy gathered his men on what remained of the floating wreckage, his own pain hidden behind deliberate calm. The ocean currents were pulling them toward the shore of Kolombangara. A Japanese-controlled island staying adrift meant certain capture or death by morning. He made a decisive choice: swim toward Plum Pudding Island, a small uninhabited patch of land estimated to be 3 miles away. With no boat, no radio, and injured men, it sounded impossible. But he believed movement gave them their only chance. Kennedy cut a strap from a life jacket, attached it to the collar of the most severely wounded crewman, and began towing him through the water. For over 4 hours, he swam using only one arm, his injured back sending sharp pain through every stroke. The rest of the crew followed, pushing debris as makeshift flotation support. Sharks circled in the distance, drawn to the oil and blood on the water. At one point, a flare shot up from Japanese forces on the shore, searching for survivors. Kennedy ordered complete silence. Every man froze. For nearly 15 minutes, they remained still as the searchlight passed over them. Eventually, they reached the shore under cover of darkness. Exhausted, they crawled onto the sand, their bodies shredded by coral. It was still before dawn. On the island, they found no fresh water, no food, and no cover from enemy patrols. Kennedy told his men, "We are alive. That is enough to start with." Even while injured, he refused to rest. At daybreak, he swam back into open water, searching for passing American boats. That swim lasted nearly 2 hours. Seeing nothing, he returned and tried again at sunset. Each attempt pushed his body beyond the limits of normal endurance. On his second evening swim, he found a floating wooden crate. Inside, 1 bag of hardtack crackers and a can of local fruit. It was barely enough for 2 people, but he rationed it for 11. The men now knew they could survive the collision, but surviving the island would require an even greater risk. Making contact with the local islanders who moved between patrol routes and had the power to decide whether these Americans lived or died. By the morning of the second day on Plum Pudding Island, morale began to sink. The men were weak, dehydrated, and exposed to direct sunlight with no shelter. Japanese patrol boats passed close enough to be heard, and every movement risked detection. Kennedy and his executive officer, Ensign Leonard Tom, agreed that survival depended on locating help, not waiting for rescue. They knew nearby islands were occasionally visited by Solomon Islander scouts who worked alongside Allied Coast Watcher units. If contact could be made, there was hope. If not, capture or starvation awaited. Kennedy made the decision to swim to Nauru Island, a larger landmass about 2.5 miles away, believed to be occasionally patrolled by friendly locals. Still injured, he set off again with Tom. The swim took over 6 hours. Waves battered them, and Kennedy's arm movements worsened his back injury with every stroke midway through. A Japanese barge cruised nearby. Both men floated motionless, heads barely above water, until it passed. When they finally reached Nauru, Kennedy carved a message onto a coconut shell using his knife. 11 alive need small boat Kennedy. That night, 2 islanders, Byuku Gasa and Eroni Kumana, found them. At first, they were cautious, unsure whether the men were Japanese or American. Kennedy, exhausted but still alert, identified himself and described the wreck. The islanders agreed to help, risking execution if caught aiding the Americans. They hid Kennedy and Tom in a coastal thicket, then set off in a dugout canoe through enemy-occupied waters. They paddled for over 6 hours to reach an Allied post. The coconut message became their proof. Coast Watcher Lieutenant Arthur Evans received it and immediately authorized a rescue. On the night of August 7th, the islanders returned with a patrol boat. One by one, Kennedy's entire surviving crew was evacuated safely. They had been stranded for 5 days, without water, without weapons, and without any realistic chance of survival. Yet every man who stood on PT-19 that night lived because their commander refused to surrender to the sea. When Kennedy and his crew were finally brought back to the Allied base, their survival was considered nothing short of miraculous. Reports stated that the odds of living through a high-speed collision with a Japanese destroyer were near zero. To endure 5 days without supplies, then coordinate rescue under enemy patrol coverage, was considered beyond standard military expectations. What stood out most was Kennedy's persistence. Despite his injuries, he repeatedly swam long distances, often at night, through shark-infested waters. These swims totaled over 7 miles. Medical staff treating him were stunned. He remained physically conscious throughout, let alone capable of leading others. Allied intelligence officers were briefed on how one small wooden boat had nearly changed the outcome of a major convoy mission. Although PT-109 did not sink Japanese ships that night, the impact of the incident reached far The Tokyo Express soon altered nighttime approach patterns, and destroyers began traveling with reduced speed near likely ambush zones. This change gave American submarines and aircraft new opportunities to intercept supply routes in that region. Kennedy's actions influenced tactical planning far beyond his direct battlefield encounter. What truly impressed senior officers was that Kennedy put his crew's safety before his own every step of the way. When asked why he kept swimming despite injury, he gave a simple answer: "They were alive. That meant I had a job to do." His after-action report contained no dramatic language. It did not mention sharks, fuel fires, or nerve-wracking swims. The narrative was so reserved that his commanding officers had to piece together the real story from survivor testimonies and local accounts. Kennedy was credited with extraordinary leadership and awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. For many who served with him, his greatest act was not surviving, but refusing to let anyone under his command be left behind in the Pacific waters. The rescue of PT-109's crew quickly spread across naval circles. But what impressed fellow service members most was the way Kennedy stayed composed throughout. Survivors remembered how he never spoke in panic, even when flames surrounded the wreckage, or when the group lay on the beach with no food or water. His instructions were always short, clear, and focused on survival. When one crewman broke down, Kennedy crouched beside him and said, "If we live one more hour, that is one more hour we fight. That's all we do." Those words became the mindset of every man on that island. Many Marines and sailors believed the Pacific War was defined by machinery, ships, planes, firepower. But what Kennedy demonstrated was that survival could come down to sheer human will. Even when tools and tactics failed, his wooden boat carried a torpedo system with nearly an 80% failure rate. His navigation depended on moonlight because he lacked radar. His strength came not from weapons, but from being unwilling to give up on his men, even while wounded. For years after, islanders who helped him retold the story of a foreign officer who swam like a man who carried the sea on his back, refusing to stop even when his legs gave out. That description became part of local folklore. When American troops later passed through the Solomon Islands, they were sometimes pointed to the same shores where Kennedy dragged his men through the surf. They called it Survivor's Point. The Pacific battlefield pushed men beyond all conventional limits. Most who faced similar disasters did not live to share it. Kennedy and his crew survived because one officer ignored the odds, challenged enemy assumptions, and relied on determination more than equipment. In a war dominated by steel and fire, it was persistence that saved them. The impact of the PT-109 incident stretched far beyond the survival of Kennedy and his crew. Naval analysts began reassessing how small, lightly armed units could operate effectively against stronger forces using unconventional tactics. Many commanders had believed that only warships with heavy armor and advanced radar could influence nighttime naval engagements. Kennedy's experience showed that speed, stealth, and human initiative could matter just as much. One report stated that enemy vessels feared what they could not detect, reinforcing the idea that wooden PT boats, though fragile, offered strategic unpredictability. Crews were encouraged to maneuver closer to enemy formations and engage aggressively rather than relying on long-range torpedo strikes. Training manuals were quietly updated to reflect nighttime ambush techniques based on human observation rather than radar. In intelligence circles, the survival of PT-109 became a case study in leadership under extreme stress. Many studies focused on how command responsibility does not end when equipment fails. Kennedy had no radio, no navigational tools, and no effective weapons once the wreckage sank. Yet, he continued leading through physical actions rather than verbal direction. Psychologists noted how decisive movement under pressure can prevent panic among small teams. Kennedy gave his men tasks even when their chances of success were slim. Each action, whether swimming to search for rescue or rationing a single can of fruit, reinforced purpose and prevented surrender to fear. Years later, when asked about the collision and rescue, Kennedy offered a simple summary. "It was involuntary. They sank my boat." Those 7 words reflected how he viewed his survival, not as heroism, but as obligation. For his crew, however, the difference was clear. He kept them alive in conditions where survival should not have been possible. In a war measured by territory and losses, the rescue of 11 men did not change the tide of the Pacific directly. But it demonstrated a truth that no Japanese destroyer could counter in that moment. Courage, when acted upon without hesitation, can alter the outcome of even a hopeless fight. The legacy of the PT-109 incident became more than just a survival story. It shifted thinking inside the U.S. military about how leadership works in extreme combat. Kennedy did not have the strongest weapons, the best position, or even full physical strength. Yet he succeeded where the odds were almost zero. His actions showed that a commander's determination could hold a team together, even when all tactical support disappeared. Analysts later noted that most crews in similar wrecks did not survive beyond the first 24 hours. Kennedy's men lasted 5 days because he refused to let them believe death was the default outcome. Every decision he made, swimming for supplies, searching for rescue, carving that message onto the coconut, gave his crew something to fight toward. In the months that followed, the victory at Iwo Jima and the collapse of Japanese supply lines marked the beginning of the end for Imperial forces in the Pacific. But among the smaller stories, those that rarely reached newspapers,